In 1852, two brothers arrived in South Bend, Indiana with $68 and two forges. They built wagons. Good wagons. Wagons that carried settlers across the Great Plains, that hauled Union Army supplies through the mud of the Civil War, that outlasted every competitor on the frontier. By the time those brothers were old men, their company had become the largest wagon manufacturer in the world. Then the automobile arrived, and they adapted. They built electric cars, then gasoline cars, then became one of the most stylish, most innovative independent automakers in America. At its peak, 24,000 people worked at the Studebaker factory in South Bend. They built the trucks that helped win World War II, the amphibious weasels that crossed frozen Belgian marshes, the aircraft engines that powered B-17 bombers over Nazi Germany. Then on December 20th, 1963, it was over. 7,000 workers were told not to come back. 114 years of manufacturing ended in a single afternoon. One worker, standing at the gate as the announcement was made, kept shouting, "It's not official yet." It was. This is the story of Studebaker, the oldest vehicle manufacturer in American history, the company that outlasted wagons, outlasted the Depression, outlasted 2 world wars, and couldn't outlast the Big Three. The Studebaker story begins in Pennsylvania, where a German immigrant family had been making wagons since 1740. Peter Studebaker built his first wagon in the British province of Maryland, more than 100 years before his grandsons would found the company that would eventually build cars. His grandsons were 5 brothers: Henry, Clement, John Moeller, Peter Everest, and Jacob. When Henry and Clement arrived in South Bend in 1850, Clement was 20 years old and took work in a blacksmith shop for 50 cents a day. In February 1852, Henry and Clement opened H&C Studebaker on the corner of Michigan and Jefferson Streets. Their starting capital was $68 and 2 forges. Their youngest brother, John Moeller, had left for California to chase the gold rush. By the time John returned, having made money not by finding gold, but by making wheelbarrows for miners, the little blacksmith shop was already growing. John bought back into the company. Henry eventually retired to his farm, and the brothers who remained built something nobody had ever quite built before. The Civil War made Studebaker. When the Union Army needed wagons, thousands of them, to move men and supplies across the country's worst roads in every kind of weather, Studebaker had the capacity, the craftsmanship, and crucially, a process to quickly age their timber so it wouldn't warp or crack in the field. Other wagon makers couldn't deliver. Studebaker delivered. After the war came the westward migration. Millions of Americans moving across the continent, every family needing a wagon. Studebaker's reputation for durability had been proven on Civil War battlefields. That reputation sold wagons to homesteaders who needed something that would actually survive the journey. By 1868, Studebaker's annual sales exceeded $350,000. By the 1870s, the company was the largest wagon manufacturer in the United States. By the 1880s, it was the largest in the world. The factory in South Bend had grown from 2 forges and 2 brothers into a complex employing thousands. Clement Studebaker commissioned a 40-room mansion on West Washington Street. Tippecanoe Place was completed in 1889, the grandest private home in Indiana. It was the physical proof of what 2 brothers with $68 and 2 forges had built over 40 years. But outside those mansion walls, the world was changing. The automobile was coming. And the Studebaker brothers, unlike virtually every other wagon company in America, were watching carefully. Most wagon companies ignored the automobile. A few tried to build cars and failed immediately. Studebaker did something different. They moved cautiously, they learned from others, and they never bet everything on a single approach. In 1902, Studebaker introduced its first electric automobiles, battery-powered cars that looked like wagons with motors. Not impressive, but a start. By 1904, Studebaker had partnered with the Garford Company of Ohio to produce gasoline-powered cars as well. The Garford partnership was uneasy. When Studebaker discovered Garford was prioritizing its own production over Studebaker's orders, the relationship collapsed. By 1911, the Garford name was gone from Studebaker products entirely. In 1911, Studebaker made it official. The Studebaker Brothers Manufacturing Company acquired the Everett Metzger Flanders Company of Detroit, giving Studebaker its own automobile engineering and production, and reorganized as the Studebaker Corporation. Capital, $23 million. It was the only successful transition of its kind. Every other major American wagon manufacturer either ignored automobiles or tried and failed. Studebaker alone crossed the divide. They were the only wagon and carriage manufacturer in American history to make a successful transition into the automobile industry. In 1920, Studebaker produced its last horse-drawn vehicle and its first South Bend-built automobile, the Light 6, on the same campus. The men who had spent their careers building wagons now built cars. By the early 1920s, South Bend was a Studebaker city. The factory employed thousands. The immigrant workers, Polish, Hungarian, Czech, Irish, had built a community around the plant. Their churches were within walking distance of the factory gate. Their children went to school together. The company was the city's heartbeat. Studebaker planted 8,000 pine trees on its proving grounds in a pattern that spelled the company name, large enough to be visible from the air. It was a statement that only a company completely confident in its permanence would make. We are here. We are not going anywhere. They were wrong about the second part, but they couldn't know that yet. Through the 1920s, Studebaker thrived. The president, the commander, the dictator, each model named to project authority and confidence. By 1929, the catalog offered 50 different models for cars alone. The future looked unlimited. Albert Russell Erskine had become company president in 1915, and he ran Studebaker through its most prosperous years. He was ambitious, flamboyant, and convinced that bigger was always better. In 1928, he paid a premium to acquire Pierce Arrow, the prestigious luxury car maker. It seemed brilliant. Studebaker would now compete at every price point, from the entry-level Erskine model to the aristocratic Pierce Arrow. Then came October 1929. The stock market collapsed. The Depression arrived. Car sales fell off a cliff. Luxury car sales essentially stopped. Pierce Arrow, the crown jewel Erskine had just bought, became an enormous anchor dragging Studebaker toward the bottom. Erskine made it worse. In 1930 and 1931, even as the company was bleeding money, even as sales were collapsing, Erskine insisted on paying large dividends to shareholders. He believed the crisis was temporary. He kept paying dividends with money the company didn't have. He also acquired 95% of the White Motor Company's stock, at an inflated price, in cash, at the worst possible moment. On March 18, 1933, Studebaker entered receivership. The banks were owed $6 million. The company that had survived the Civil War, the Panic of 1873, and World War I had been brought down by one man's overconfidence and one catastrophic economic collapse. Erskine was pushed out. On July 1, 1933, Albert Russell Erskine died by suicide. Two men inherited the wreckage, Paul Hoffman and Harold Vance. They sold Pierce Arrow. They dropped in profitable models. They cut everything that could be cut. And they put a designer named Raymond Loewy to work on something new. By December 1933, the company was back in profit. By 1935, Studebaker emerged from receivership to a citywide celebration in South Bend. By 1939, the new Studebaker Champion, affordable, reliable, designed by Loewy, was selling better than anything the company had produced in years. The company had come back from the dead. It had survived the unsurvivable. That resilience was about to be tested again. When America entered World War II in December 1941, Studebaker had been making trucks since 1929. Military trucks, commercial trucks, trucks of every size and configuration. That experience would prove invaluable. The United States Army needed a 2.5-ton, six-wheel drive cargo vehicle that could carry men and supplies over any terrain, in any weather. The specifications were demanding. The timeline was brutal. Studebaker delivered the US 6. Studebaker built over 200,000 US 6 trucks during the war. They went everywhere. To the British in North Africa, to the Free French in Italy, to the Canadians pushing through the Netherlands, and most of all, 152,000 of them, to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. Joseph Stalin reportedly sent Studebaker's president a personal message of appreciation for the trucks. When Soviet engineers designed their own military trucks after the war, the ZIL-151, the GAZ-51, they used the Studebaker US 6 as the template. The trucks that helped the Red Army defeat the Wehrmacht became the foundation of Soviet military transport for 30 years. But the truck was not Studebaker's most remarkable wartime contribution. The M29 Weasel was a tracked, amphibious cargo carrier designed for one purpose: to go where nothing else could go. Snow, mud, flooded marshes. The concept came from a British inventor named Geoffrey Pike, who envisioned commandos using fast snow vehicles to attack Nazi industrial installations in Norway. Dwight Eisenhower personally lobbied for the Weasel to be developed. Studebaker was chosen to build it. The Weasel used the engine from Studebaker's own Champion automobile, a 6-cylinder unit repurposed for military use. 20-inch rubber tracks. A sealed hull that could float in calm water. A 300-mile range. It could carry a half-ton load through sand, snow, or standing water where no wheeled vehicle could follow. Canadian forces used Weasels extensively during the Battle of the Scheldt in late 1944, clearing flooded approaches to the port of Antwerp through terrain that was impassable any other way. At Iwo Jima, Marine divisions used them to haul supplies across the black volcanic sand under fire. Studebaker also produced 63,789 aircraft engines for the B-17 Flying Fortress, each with nearly 8,000 individual parts, each one hand-assembled and tested. 5,600 Studebaker employees went to the war. 111 of them never came home. When the war ended, Studebaker was in the strongest financial position it had occupied in 20 years. The workforce was experienced and loyal. The country was about to experience the greatest economic boom in American history, and Studebaker was ready with something special. First by far with a post-war car. That was Studebaker's slogan for the 1947 models. It was completely true. While General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were still selling warmed-over pre-war designs, Studebaker introduced cars that looked like nothing the American public had ever seen. The designer was Raymond Loewy, one of the most important industrial designers of the 20th century. Born in Paris, arrived in America in 1919 with $40 and boundless ambition, Loewy had reshaped the look of everything from Coca-Cola bottles to locomotives. Now he turned his eye to Studebaker. The 1947 Studebakers were aerodynamic in an era when most American cars were upright boxes. The rear was smooth and tapered. The front was clean and modern. The whole package looked like it belonged to the future. Buyers loved it. Sales exploded. Studebaker had the most successful post-war launch of any American automaker. The 1950 and 1951 models introduced the bullet-nose front end, a chrome cone mounted in the center of the grille, inspired by a fighter jet's nose. Polarizing. Some people loved it. Some people joked you couldn't tell if the car was coming or going. Either way, people noticed. People talked. People bought. In 1950, the South Bend complex employed 24,000 workers and produced 343,000 automobiles. Those numbers would never be reached again. But nobody knew that in 1950. The workers at Studebaker in those years were the second and third generation of the immigrant families that had come to South Bend for factory jobs. Polish-American families, Hungarian-American families, Irish-American families. They had built South Bend as much as Studebaker had. Their churches, their social clubs, their corner stores and their bars. When the plant was hiring, the neighborhood thrived. What happened to the plant happened to everything. In 1953, Loewy's team, specifically a designer named Robert Burke, produced the Starliner and Starlight coupes. They were, by almost any measure, the most beautiful American cars of the post-war era. Low, long, graceful. Their aerodynamics were so clean that the design would inspire engineers working on the 1993 Dodge Ram. Road and Track called the Starliner the most beautiful car in America. The Museum of Modern Art in New York put one on display. Automotive historians still argue that the 1953 Studebaker coupes belong in the conversation for the greatest car designs of the 20th century. They also nearly saved the company. Not quite, but nearly. The problem was simple. Studebaker made beautiful cars. But the big three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, made cars in volumes that Studebaker could not match, at prices it could not compete with. Ford and General Motors had entered an era of brutal price competition in the early 1950s. They were spending heavily on advertising, on annual model changes, on dealer incentives. For them, the cost of this competition was manageable. For Studebaker, it was lethal. Studebaker's break-even point, the number of cars it needed to sell each year just to cover costs, was dangerously high. The factory was old. Management had made wage concessions during good years that left them with a cost structure they couldn't sustain in lean ones. In 1953, the year the Starliner appeared to universal acclaim, Studebaker made a profit. Then management made a catastrophic mistake. They built too many plain, boxy sedan models and not enough of the sleek coupes. Demand for the coupes outpaced sedans 4-1. The inventory was wrong. The year ended in loss. In 1954, desperate for scale, Studebaker merged with the Packard Motor Car Company to form the Studebaker-Packard Corporation. The theory was sound. Two struggling independents combined might have the resources to compete with the Big Three. The reality was a disaster. Packard president James Nance reviewed Studebaker's books after the merger and was reportedly horrified. Studebaker's break-even point was 50,000 units higher than the company had ever actually sold. Packard tried to fix Studebaker. Studebaker dragged Packard down instead. By 1958, the storied Packard name was discontinued entirely. The merger had destroyed Packard while failing to save Studebaker. But then came the lark. And for one brief, shining moment, it looked like Studebaker might actually survive. The Lark was a compact car introduced for the 1959 model year, smaller, lighter, and more fuel-efficient than the full-sized American cars dominating the market. It arrived at exactly the right moment. The economy was soft. Gas prices were rising. Buyers were looking for something more sensible. The Lark sold over 130,000 units in its first year. It delivered a $28 million profit, the most Studebaker had made in years. For the first time in the better part of a decade, the mood in South Bend was genuinely optimistic. Then came 1960, and Ford introduced the Falcon, and Chevrolet introduced the Corvair, and Plymouth introduced the Valiant. The Big Three had watched Studebaker succeed with the compact and decided they wanted that market. They brought their economies of scale, their dealer networks, their advertising budgets, their ability to price below cost temporarily if necessary. The Lark had created the compact car market. Now the Big Three were taking it. Lark sales dropped, then dropped again. By 1962, NBC television aired a documentary called Studebaker, Fight for Survival. The title said everything. The documentary itself became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Buyers who might have considered a Studebaker saw that program and thought, why would I buy a car from a company that might not honor the warranty? Sales fell further. The prophecy fulfilled itself. In 1961, a new Studebaker president named Sherwood Egbert decided that the only way to save the company was to do something so dramatic, so undeniably impressive, that it would force the world to take notice. He called Raymond Loewy. He gave him 6 weeks and a budget that would have made the designers at General Motors laugh. He said, "Build me something unforgettable." Loewy's team worked in a rented house in Palm Springs, California, away from the South Bend factory. In 6 weeks, against every rational expectation, they produced the Avanti. It had no grille. The nose was clean, unbroken fiberglass. The body was sculptural, almost architectural. It looked like a concept car that had somehow slipped off the auto show turntable and onto a production line. At the Bonneville Salt Flats, a modified Avanti hit over 170 miles per hour with its supercharged 289 V8 engine. It broke 29 world speed records in a single session. It was the fastest American production car of its time. Road and Track called it a radical departure from the commonplace. It offered front disc brakes, a first for any American production car. It had safety features that Motor Trend praised as genuinely ahead of their time. The problem was production. Studebaker had contracted with an outside company to supply the fiberglass bodies. That company couldn't keep pace. Egbert had planned to sell 20,000 Avantis in 1962. He built 1,200. Dealers had customers waiting. Cars weren't arriving. Customers bought something else. By the time the production problems were resolved, the window had closed. Egbert himself fell ill, diagnosed with cancer in 1963, and was forced out of the presidency before he could see his vision through. A month after Egbert left, the announcement came. On December 9, 1963, the board of Studebaker announced that the South Bend plant would close. The automotive division had lost $40 million since 1959, the last year of profitability. Production would end 11 days later. 7,000 workers still on the payroll were told to find other jobs. Thousands more, laid off in previous years, hoping to be called back, would never return. On December 20th, 1963, the South Bend plant built its last Larks and its last Hawks. On December 26th, the last of Annie came off the line. When management called the workers together to make the official announcement, one man wouldn't accept it. He kept saying, "It's not official yet. It's not official yet." Some reports say workers had to be escorted from the building. Others describe men sitting down and refusing to leave, as if their presence could somehow prevent what was already decided. The factory that had employed 24,000 people at its peak, that had built the wagons that won the Civil War, that had sent trucks to every theater of World War II, went silent. The South Bend community was devastated. Studebaker had been present in this city since 1852. It had funded the parks, the hospitals, the churches. It had been the reason for the city's existence as an industrial center. People said the word Studebaker the way they said South Bend, as if the two things were the same thing, as if one could not exist without the other. The owner of a clothing store in downtown South Bend said it as plainly as it could be said. "This is not Studebaker, Indiana. This is South Bend, Indiana." He was trying to be optimistic. He was trying to say the city would survive without the company. But for the workers who had spent 30 years on those assembly lines, the distinction meant nothing. For them, South Bend and Studebaker had always been the same thing.